Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Tim Gray. I'm the Executive Director of Environmental Defense, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the seventh and final episode of our recovery series today, Threats and Opportunities for Our Great Lakes. Across this series, we've answered your most pressing questions on current environmental issues during our pandemic, and we've looked at what solutions can pivot Canada towards a greener, healthier, and more resilient economy that puts people and planet first. Well, this is our last episode. We'll be hosting a series of online summer events. In fact, next week, be sure to join us for an online community screening. We'll be screening the film, The Story of Plastic, by the people who made The Story of Stuff. We'll follow that with a live Q&A with our experts, so please stay tuned for that. Now, many of you have been with us regularly throughout the recovery series, but for those of you who may not know us, Environmental Defense is a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Algonquin peoples, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of the land, and that the Bancroft area, where I'm close to today, is covered by the Williams Treaty. Today, we're all calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we are on today. As we start this webinar, let's keep in mind that it is Indigenous peoples who are disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Now, today, we have two special guests with us. The first is Dr. Anastasia Lintner, who is the Special Projects Counsel of the Healthy Great Lakes Program for the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and Kelsey Scarfone, who's the Water Program Manager at Environmental Defense. Welcome, Anastasia and Kelsey.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, hi.
Hi. Before we get started, I wanted to explain a bit about how we'll be using the webinar software today. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a button called Q&A. Just hit that button and type in your questions, and our team will be able to relay them to me. We normally get a large volume of questions, so we won't get to them all, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. We'll also be using the chat box, and it's at the bottom of the toolbar. And you can have a fun interactive activity that we're going to explain to you in a moment, so get ready for that. And I just want to provide a little bit of an introduction before we get to our guest speakers today. We're really lucky when it comes to water in Canada. You know, we're surrounded by 3 oceans, we have thousands of rivers, hundreds of thousands of lakes, and many, many streams. These bodies of water include the Great Lakes, which hold 20% of the world's surface fresh water. So you think of it like one-fifth of all the fresh water on the surface of the earth we happen to have in the Great Lakes, which we share with the US. These lakes provide drinking water for 80% of Ontarians, support a $5 billion economy, and a really diverse ecosystem. However, it might surprise you that more and more of these lakes are under threat. Here are just some of the problems that the lakes are currently facing. Every summer, parts of Lake Erie are covered by harmful and sometimes toxic algae blooms that can kill fish, make water unsafe for swimming, and hurt local businesses. 22 million pounds of plastic end up in the Great Lakes every year. At times, part of the Great Lakes have as much plastic pollution in them as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The lakes are also dealing with high water levels due to recent climate change. The Toronto Islands have been closed during recent summers due to flooding. And earlier this year, parts of Chatham and Kent counties were under a state of emergency due to flooding along the Lake Erie shoreline. Throughout the Great Lakes, climate change impacts are taking hold. These threats are putting vulnerable communities at risk, and more action and investment is desperately needed. On the other hand, when the Great Lakes are at their best, they provide the important places for us to connect to water. They support sustainable ecotourism, commercial fisheries, and most important of all, our clean drinking water. Today, we'll gain a better understanding of how water is managed and explore the legal framework for managing the Great Lakes. We'll explore how we can protect these lakes and address the threats by investing in resilience. Smart investments in the Great Lakes can be part of our national recovery strategy. As case studies show, they deliver both environmental, social, and economic benefits. So let's get started. First, our first guest is going to be Anastasia. Anastasia is, as I mentioned, the Special Projects Counsel for the Healthy Great Lakes Program at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. She holds a PhD in Environment and Natural Resource Economics from the University of Guelph and an LLB from Osgoode Hall Law School. Anastasia is an experienced environmental lawyer, professor, and researcher, and we have done a lot of work with her over the years. Today, she's going to discuss our connections with water, the Great Lakes, and the legal frameworks that strive to protect them. Anastasia, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I am very honored to have been invited to be part of the very last of the recovery series. It's something that I care deeply about and work in on a daily basis. I'm going to just, before I get into my remarks, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Canadian Environmental Law Association. If you haven't encountered us yet, we are a specialty legal aid clinic. Specialty because within the legal aid system, our clinic and a number of other specialty clinics focus on a specific area of law instead of having a broad swath of services like other community clinics that you might be familiar with in your cities and towns. So our specialization is on environmental issues. We are funded by Legal Aid Ontario almost exclusively. And the Healthy Great Lakes Program, which is why I'm called Special Projects Council. The Healthy Great Lakes Program is a project that's funded outside of Legal Aid Ontario by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And the Canadian Environmental Law Association, we provide a number of services, including representation and summary advice, as well as policy implementation, which we call law reform. We do analysis, we support communities who want to understand what the new proposals or what existing laws mean for the environment. And we also do engagement and community development, which in legal aid language is called public legal education. And this is a type of webinar that fulfills that need to engage the community. And we are advocates for environmental justice. So in raising the voices of those that are most vulnerable, as we know, and Tim just said, low-income and Indigenous communities tend to bear an unfair share of environmental burdens, and we want to advocate on their behalf and with them. I'll off the top tell you my three messages for you today. How we are interconnected with water, how we're responsible for safeguarding, and how we need to rise to the occasion and make investments that are commensurate with the importance of water. And I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. But first, we're going to talk about interconnectedness, and we're going to do that with an interactive activity. And we're going to build a word cloud together. So as this is getting loaded up for you to see, you can interact with us in two ways. You could pick up a separate device and type in menti.com, menti.com, and at the top it'll give you a code 431835 is the code to participate in this exercise. And if you're just on one device, if you want to look down at the chat box, you can click on the link in there and use the code to get involved. And all you need to do is type in some words that come to mind when you think of water. I've set it up so that you can type in more than one word. So if you submit, then you can submit another one and another one and another one and just keep going for as long as you like, as many words as you like. And while you're doing that, I'd ask you to just think about water. When you wake up in the morning and step out of bed, you're probably interacting with water pretty quickly. I wake up, I brush my teeth, I have a shower, I put on the kettle and make a cup of coffee. And I'm thinking about how I'm connected to and interacting with water all day long. I remember a Star Trek episode from a while back where the alien being called humans ugly bags of mostly water because we're made up of water. Water is life. There's lots of campaigns about that out there. It's crucially important. And as you can see, as our word cloud is building, life is really coming out on top. And water, one of the things I do love about water as a chemical, the chemical H2O is a rule breaker. It doesn't even obey the usual laws of chemistry because the solid form floats on its liquid form, and we don't know of anything else that does that. So it's a passion, it's an interest, we're interconnected with it, and I think we'll stop sharing this awesome exercise. I just want to do that all day, but we'll stop that for now and carry on with my remarks. Those water molecules are cycling around in the system. You may have seen this. If you work in water a lot, you see this probably and think about this on a daily basis. And you may remember it from elementary school or your science classes, that the water, the molecules are basically non-renewable, and they cycle around and around and around the ultimate reuse system. And we need to think about that when we're thinking about how we share responsibility for taking care of water. As Tim invited us to do, I like to think about where I am. I'm here in the community now called Kingston, and this is Dish with One Spoon treaty territory, an offering of peace between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share the lands, to share the watershed, to have one dish. And it means that we're all responsible for making sure the dish is always full, and that we take what we need, but we make sure there's more left and some left for others. And in that principle of sharing and respecting the water, similar principle was brought into the Boundary Waters Treaty between the British Crown and the government of the US in the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. As is often the case, a crisis sometimes makes us recognize that we need to do something. And in this case, jointly governing waters that cross the international boundary between the US and Canada needed some sort of agreement about how those rules were going to apply. And within the Boundary Waters Treaty, there is a no harm rule, basically that you can use water sort of in your sovereign state, but not to harm the other party, the other country, the other nation's ability to use the water. And it's out of this Boundary Waters Treaty that we have an important governance structure for the Great Lakes Basin through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. First signed in 1972, again, a crisis sort of led us to make a commitment to take care of the health of the waters, and a shared governance structure about how that was going to happen between the two countries. The challenge in Canada, just to get a little bit more geeky, is that Canada would sign that Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement federally, but then the province needs to implement it. So we need agreements between federal and provincial governments. And then we need, within each of those governments, there's many ministries that handle water issues, and all of that sort of need to collaborate together creates some of our biggest challenges. And one of the things that we're learning now in this crisis of the pandemic is that vulnerability is not a fixed thing. If you're talking about a vulnerable community, it's not always going to be defined exactly the same. It's going to be dynamic. And when we're thinking about vulnerability in COVID, we asked everybody to make sure they stay home, and if they can, and wash your hands a lot. And if you don't have safe water, access to safe water, then you're made vulnerable just by that situation. And it tends to be more remote communities, and Indigenous communities are the ones that are at risk in terms of having safe drinking water. So all of this leads us to, at least for me, to recommend that we make sure that we're investing in our laws, in our policies, in our implementation, in our spending that equals the value of water. And from a legal perspective, it's employing a number of environmental law principles. I'm definitely not going to go through them all, but I'll just remind you that some of these are already in our laws in Canada and in our agreements with other nations, and we need to make sure that they're well implemented. And this month, it's the 20th anniversary of Walkerton, the crisis in Walkerton that demonstrated the vulnerability, the risks, the lack of resilience in our drinking water systems, and led us to changing things quite a bit. And we have another opportunity like that right now. And one of the really important lessons, I think, from Walkerton and the legacy today is that redundancy isn't necessarily a bad thing. duplication, redundancy when you're talking about safeguarding health, crucially important feature of your systems and programs. So as I said, these are the messages I have for you today. And we are interconnected with water. We're responsible collectively for safeguarding it, and we're going to need to up our investment to demonstrate that we value water with our effort in implementation and spending the same way that we know it's valuable to us individually. And with that, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Connect with CELA if you want assistance or want to have a speaker come to one of your events. And as we lawyers like to say, thank you, Tim. That concludes my submissions.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. For those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from Anastasia Lintner, and Anastasia helped us explore our connections to water and reviewed the legal frameworks that govern the Great Lakes. So next, we're going to hear from Kelsey Scarfone. Kelsey is the Environmental Defense's Water Program Manager. She has a Master's of Sustainability from Brock University, so down the Niagara Peninsula, right between two Great Lakes, where she studied corporate water taking and the human right to water. Kelsey is passionate about restoring the Great Lakes and protecting our precious Canadian freshwaters. Over to you, Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you all for being here today and listening to this conversation. I'm calling in today from Robinson, Huron Treaty Lands in the traditional territory of the Tikamitching and Anishinaabe. Today, I really want to talk to you about why the Great Lakes need to be part of our recovery and part of a green recovery. And so here's my favorite photo of the Great Lakes, because as Anastasia said, they don't function with political boundaries, and this map doesn't have any. So I love it for that. And so I invite you to, point out where maybe you were calling in from today on this map, or where perhaps you visited before, and invite you to really consider that we're all part of this system together. So, even me in Sudbury today, I'm not close by one of the Great Lakes necessarily in the shoreline, but as you can see, definitely part of the Huron Basin and part of this interconnected system. And so, we could do a whole webinar on Great Lakes history in terms of what they've been through, but we can sum it up by saying they've been through a lot. And so in the early 1900s, the Great Lakes were an industrial dumping ground. Sewage and toxics were contaminating the lakes. Rivers were catching fire. And in the 70s, Lake Erie was declared dead. And because of decades of citizen action and a lot of activism in the Great Lakes between US and Canada, those governments were spurred on to take action. And so in 1972, we got our Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and we've made a ton of progress since then in cleaning up that toxic legacy. And now, the Great Lakes are the beautiful spaces we enjoy today. But just as Tim said, they're facing this whole new set of threats between climate change, algae blooms are back on Lake Erie, there's invasive species and plastics everywhere. And so we really need to be, watching closely and taking action to protect them from this new set of threats. But I want to focus on the positives today, and that is when our Great Lakes perform at their best, they are so important to drinking water for 80% of Ontarians. They support tourism, fisheries, both commercial and recreational. 4,000 species call the Great Lakes region home, and 200 of those are at risk. But they're also important to our own recreation and mental health and well-being. And you can see that that's true just by looking at Canadian shoreline communities in the Great Lakes region, a few pictured here, of course, and you can just tell how important those spaces are to those communities. And they're also home to natural wonders and gems in our provincial and national parks, iconic places like Niagara Falls and the Tobermory shipwrecks, but none of this is possible to enjoy unless our Great Lakes are kept in good health. And so I want to talk about some lessons from the United States and how they've really invested in that natural asset and invested in the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes on their side of the border. And so this is a federal initiative called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and it's funding that began in 2010, and it was associated with spending in that country coming out of the financial crisis that happened in 2009. And wasn't totally intended to be stimulus package dollars, but has performed that way over time. And they've, through this investment, over 3 billion years in the last decade, around $300 million a year, have achieved some amazing environmental results. So they've kept, over 1 million pounds of phosphorus, that's a nutrient that causes algae blooms, out of the water. Also created or restored hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat, and cleaning up those toxic legacies from years past, like I was speaking about earlier. And I think what's interesting about this fund is it has such strong bipartisan support. It has not only survived the Trump administration, it's actually grown in that time, because state and local representatives, regardless of political stripe, realize the value in investing in the Great Lakes and protecting and restoring them. They can see the benefits this has on their local communities. It also has a really amazing benefit on the economy. So for every dollar invested in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, over $3 of economic spin-off activity occurs. A big chunk of this is realized in the tourism sector. It's also creating and supporting thousands of jobs and really propping up economies like commercial and recreational fisheries that are worth about $7 billion. So it's a real economic driver for the region. Now I want to talk about one area in particular. As you can see, there's hundreds of projects, so it's hard to choose just one. But I'm going to talk to you today about Ashtabula, Ohio. And the Ashtabula River is a river that feeds into Lake Erie. And this is one of those sites in the 80s that was identified as really needing some cleanup, had a lot of toxic sediment and that toxic legacy that we talked about. And so there's been over $20 million invested through Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects. And they've been able to achieve things like over 100,000 cubic yards of toxic sediment cleaned up. They've created fish habitat. They've restored and created more wetlands, and fixed up their local beach. And this has had big impacts on the local economy for a very small town of just 20,000 people. They've seen a 42% jump in their boat registrations for their local harbor, 27 new businesses in quite a small community. And in 2016, had over $400 million in tourism sales. So these are huge numbers for a small town. And in reading the case studies, you hear quotes like, "Now I can see the lake. I want to get out there. I want to experience it. I want to get on a boat." And the water quality has improved so greatly in this region that now they can support a steelhead fishery. So the Ohio Natural Resources Council is stocking that river with steelhead. And if you're a fisher person on the call, you're excited about this because it's a very exciting fish to catch, but it also speaks to just how good the water quality is, that people can now catch and eat the fish they catch. And we do know this to be true in Canada as well. We don't have a decade of really great investments to compare to what's been happening in the United States, but we know that in Hamilton Harbor and cleaning up the Randall Reef, a contaminated site, has been estimated to generate almost $1 billion in economic benefit by 2032. And actually Collingwood Harbor was one of these listed areas of concern in the 80s and has been cleaned up so much so that it's been delisted, which is very exciting. And that has been shown to generate a lot of positive benefits on the local economy as well. And the Toronto waterfront really wouldn't be what it is today unless the lake was, being looked after properly. But this is another situation where the current threats are really taking hold. So I want to talk about that really quickly. On Toronto Island, we've had high water levels causing floods in the last 3 years, 2017 and 2019 especially bad. I understand that right now today there's sandbagging happening on the island and it's becoming quite flooded right now. And so not only is this a big hit to the businesses on the island, the tourism, dollars that rely on the island's health, it's a huge loss to our outdoor recreational space, to important, social impacts of losing that natural space in the city. It's hard to interact with nature, but the island is always an amazing place to connect with water and do that. So this really demonstrates our need to be resilient. And so we can invest in resilience the same way they have in the US. By naturalizing our shorelines, wetlands, trees, these are all green infrastructure pieces that we talk about. And if we invest in that, it will make us way more adaptable to the changes that climate change is going to bring about. It's also a really good economic driver. So Green Infrastructure Ontario just released these stats about that sector and contributing over $8 billion to the GDP in our province and well over 100,000 jobs. So that's a big employer for Ontario. And when we invest in green infrastructure, we get all kinds of co-benefits. So great infrastructure, you build a bridge, you get a bridge, which is all fine and great. But with green infrastructure, you get even more. You get not only a wetland, you get flood protection, you get better water quality, recreational opportunities. So we can really add to our communities by investing here. And that's what we can do in the Great Lakes. And so by investing in Great Lakes protection and restoration, we can really boost our local economies and be more resilient. So at environmentaldefense.ca/take action, you can send a letter to your local representatives about this. And that is my case for the Great Lakes in our green recovery. So I will turn it back to Tim. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Kelsey, and thanks to both you and Anastasia. We've got some questions building up from the audience, which is great. Just a couple that sort of top of mind for me, just listening to your both of your presentations. The algal bloom problem seems to be a really big one in Lake Erie. Just how big of a problem is this? I mean, is this an inconvenience, or is this something that really means that we stand to really lose something if we can't get it under control? So maybe Kelsey, start with you, and then Anastasia, if you have some thoughts, that'd be great as well.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, it's definitely a huge problem, and it's not only that the algae blooms are inconvenient and kind of stinky. They actually can put our drinking water under threat. Toledo in 2014, the city of Toledo lost their drinking water due to an algae bloom. But in this conversation about the economy, those algae blooms are actually costing the Canadian Lake Erie economy $300 million a year. And if they are left unchecked, it could cost us almost $6 billion by 2050. And so just like I said at the beginning of the presentation, if we want to have those amazing experiences and those interactions with the lake that we treasure so much, that we rely on that lake being healthy. So it's really important that we take action, both the provincial and the federal government.
Thanks. Anastasia?
Yeah, I'll just add that when we're talking about Lake Erie and the latest efforts to set a target, to develop plans, we saw in action multiple levels of government getting together across the Canada-US border and saying, this is going to be our target for Lake Erie. We need to figure out where the sources are, and then we need to take action. And on the Canadian side, our so-called domestic action plan is sort of looking at who all could help contribute. And that's also consistent with Ontario's Great Lakes Protection Act, which is sort of protect and restore the ecological health, but also get everybody engaged that needs to be engaged to help with that problem. Those are the two purposes of that legislation. So what we need then is, we have the targets, we have a draft plan, let's move it on to implementation and getting the investments that are needed to see it through.
Great. Yeah, something that comes to mind for me too, when Kelsey was showing the map of the basin, dissolve those boundaries, the Canadian border and the US border and all the state boundaries on the American side, and just look at where you live relative to each of the Great Lakes. You really get a sense, if you think about that land and having traveled across it, how much of that, especially in the more southern areas, is dominated by agriculture. Of course, more in Northern Ontario, there's a lot more forest cover, but so much of it for the Southern Lakes is in lands that have been converted to agriculture. And we know that with advent of larger farms and more industrial type of agriculture, there's so much pesticide, there's so much fertilizer that's running off. So many wetlands have been removed and drained and tile drains put in. The whole story around growing industrialization of agriculture. It seems to me that we really need to have programs that operate at scale for the farm community to be able to help with this problem. And I just wondered if both of you could dig into that a little bit more, because it seems to me that any kind of program that we're going to implement that doesn't interact very strongly with the farm community is kind of destined to fail. So what is it that we can do to make sure that we're changing practices in a way that is supported by the farm community, but also helps them in some way? And what would maybe some of those ways be? And so how do we do this? So maybe Anastasia, start with you, and then Kelsey.
Sure. I have a sweet spot in my heart for farmers. I grew up in a small town where everybody that I went to school with was bussed in from the farms around our community. I went to the University of Guelph. My PhD research was about how farming can sort of solve this problem of nutrient pollution. And what I can say is that the reality of farming is that it's not just one type of farming. And the second thing I'll say about that is there are programs created by farmers for farmers like ALUS Canada. ALUS stands for Alternative Land Use Alternative Land Use Services, because it's about the ecological goods and services that if a farmer decides to have a restored wetland on their property, take land out of production and create these services for all of us, let's compensate them for doing that. And ALUS is a program, ALUS Canada does that. And it's not being picked up everywhere. It needs, again, it needs investment.
Kelsey, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just agree, like definitely with what Anastasia has said so far, and just emphasize that agriculture is a huge piece of the puzzle here, particularly when it comes to Lake Erie. But I'll also say that, you know, in my capacity in this job, I've had such fabulous interactions with the agricultural sector and with farmers who are very dedicated to saving Lake Erie because they've also, you know, have these amazing connections with the lake. And, you know, I think it's really interesting to look at what's been done in the States, and this Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding that, you know, I was just speaking about has a whole section dedicated to you know, funding those on the farm projects. So we call them like edge of field projects, or creating wetlands, you know, adjacent to farmlands, or buffer strips, which is basically vegetation preventing some of that runoff phosphorus from entering the stream system eventually into the lake. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to invest in that here in Canada. And, you know, through what's happened in the States, they've been able to keep over 1 million pounds of phosphorus out of the system, which is really significant. Yeah, but there needs to be that support there for agricultural partners. And I'll also just say that I know in Ontario right now, the demand for those types of projects on private land, most of it agriculture, far exceeds what we can deliver, or what the groups, you know, doing these projects on the ground can deliver. So the more we can boost that with a good amount of investment, the better off we're going to be. There's definitely demand for it because farmers want to be doing the right thing and having these projects on their farms.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you know, my experience interacting with the people, you know, in the ALICE program, there are other programs as well, but that one's been very popular and growing because it does pay farmers a land rental for, you know, a restored wetland or a stream buffer, et cetera. So it's a very attractive way to get people involved. You know, the commitment to doing the right thing coming from the people involved in that program, and, you know, both the farmers involved, but the staff involved in the charity as well, is really quite incredible. And, you know, if we can expand that, then, you know, some of the culture around doing this and the awareness of the co-benefits for agriculture, for streams, for water quality, I think will really grow. So I'm really hopeful that there will be more money available for these kind of programs. So I'm going to switch now to questions from the audience, because there's a bunch of them coming in. And the first one is related to algae. Surprise. Someone's asking a question here. Who's the name here? Let me just have a look at who this is coming from. We have, where are we here? Yes, from Marta. Can the algae in the lakes be harvested to make biofuel? It looks like there's a lot out there. Kelsey, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Yeah, it would seem like, you know, really intuitive, and it's a good idea on paper. But what we don't want to create is a scenario where that we're creating like a market value for that algae. It's and often can be toxic. So while it's a good idea in theory, it's not something we want to really anticipate. We want to prevent those blooms from happening in the first place, especially because, you know, in Lake Erie, the blue-green or cyanobacteria that is part of this algae bloom can be highly toxic and really be a threat. So we want to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Right. And another pollutant that we haven't talked about yet, but I know that Environmental Defense, we do a lot of work on this with other organizations, is that of road salt. And we have a question here. Will the threat of road salt be addressed? I guess addressed by government. Turning our fresh water into salt water is a major risk. And maybe Kelsey, again, just maybe chat a little bit about some of the stuff that you've been involved with around the salt problem.
Yeah, for sure. So, and I'll just say a few things really quickly and let Anastasia jump in, because with WWF Canada, World Wildlife Fund Canada, Anastasia and I have been involved in a lot of conversations about how we can address this issue. And so road salt or chlorides, which is just a fancy way of saying salts, are increasingly showing up in really shocking numbers, especially around the GTA. And if we go back to in the streams and rivers in the GTA, and if we go back to that map of the Great Lakes, again, it operates as at a watershed. So everything is going to, end up in the Great Lakes eventually. And that's a real issue because freshwater species, particularly a lot of species at risk, cannot tolerate that level of salt. On the human side of things, the salt is in some cases seeping into groundwater. So that's happening in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, to the point where if you're on a sodium restricted diet, there's notices about the salt content in our tap water. So it's definitely a problem that needs to be addressed. And there's a lot that we can do at home by just researching how much you really need. You only need about a small handful for a sidewalk slab of pavement, but it's also in those big commercial applications. So that's a huge piece that we need to address. And so we're doing some collaborative work to encourage the provincial government to make those changes at scale. And there's a certification called Smart About Salt, where those large-scale contractors and landscapers who are applying those large amounts of salt can learn about the proper amount, the right types of application. You can use a liquid brine before a storm event that can be really effective as well. But there has to be some kind of incentive, because what's driving a lot of the over-application is that fear of liability, of being sued for someone slipping or tripping. So it's an over-application into the excess. In the winter, you turn into these parking lots and they're like covered in chunks of salt. That's all ending up in our watershed into the Great Lakes. So we're working pretty hard to try to address that. And I think maybe I'll turn it over to Anna. She might be keen to talk a little bit about that, fear of litigation piece that has become such a problem for road salt.
Sure. So on the sort of, one of the things we've called for is that there be a specific provincial water quality objective that's different than the national objective, because what's going on in the Great Lakes and the levels of salt that we can actually, allow to ensure we have aquatic health is different than elsewhere in the country. And climate change is impacting that and all kinds of things. So we've called on the government to give us a provincial water quality objective, so we have something that we're all trying to head towards. And then on the liability, there's one of the challenges is the misperception of liability and what individuals can do to protect themselves. But for many, companies that are landscapers in the summer and there's salt spreaders in the winter, just the fact that they may be subject to a claim kind of sets us up to be way more cautious, way more salt than is needed. And that is a sort of like, how do we help people understand that? One of the mechanisms that is being used now in the States is that if a company becomes certified in something like Smart About Salt, then it would be protective in the legal system. And so in this sort of working group, we're talking about putting together some way in which the Ontario government could also create a system that sort of debunks the actual liability and assists those who are trying really to not use salt. And then, yeah, get the word out. If you see salt, if you can see a pile of salt, you've used too much, but not sea salt like the sea.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll say on that is that you can use, we're kind of past the salt season now, but you can use the hashtag #LessSalty and on Twitter or Instagram to kind of make a bit of a photo record of these oversalt applications and see that there's a whole online community starting to talk about this. So if you can remember that for the winter, it's #less_salty.
Great. Thanks, Kelsey. We have a question from George K, switching gears away from salt to nuclear pollution. What is the extent of nuclear pollution and the risk of the federal government's deep burial program for highly radioactive waste near the Great Lakes? So this is a proposal to bury radioactive waste from the nuclear plant in the Bruce area, I believe, near the shores, or even I think under the lake, perhaps in the lake bed, over near Lake Huron. So maybe Anastasia, do you want to speak to this? And then maybe Kelsey, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, it's, I can just say off the top, it's not my file at CELA, so I don't know it as well as everybody else that is involved in it. But certainly, as we strive to figure out what to do with wastes, it is imperative that we find mechanisms to do it that aren't going to put water at risk. And so on that, my understanding is that if we're going to find new ways to store the waste, one is that we have to somehow wean ourselves off nuclear at some point, but if we need to find ways to store the waste, then let's invest in understanding from the experts how to do it in the best means possible. And my understanding of the deep geological repository is that if it's going to be a risk to groundwater, then let's keep talking about how to do it better and different.
Right. Yeah, I think, you know, at an intuitive level, having radioactive waste that needs to be managed for thousands of years in a place where it could end up being connected with, through groundwater, the Great Lakes, seems on the surface like a really bad idea. I guess the question is, you know, where should it go? Or, you know, should it in fact stay at the surface so that we can actively manage it for those very long periods of time that are required to deal with something like this? Kelsey, anything else to add on this?
No, I think, you know, I agree with what's been said so far. I think it's just interesting to reflect on the Great Lakes and how these issues have come up in sort of some of the history of it. Like there was a time where there was a proposal to ship nuclear waste across the Great Lakes, and everybody went, no, like no. So it's an interesting topic, but of course, yeah, there's a lot to balance. But like we've established in our word cloud, water is life, and we can't take any risks when it comes to the Great Lakes.
Thanks. Question from Adrienne. How are zebra mussels being managed, and are there other invasive species in the Great Lakes causing problems? I think the answer is yes, in terms of others. But Kelsey, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yeah, zebra mussels are a problem. Now there's another type of mussel on the scene called the quagga mussel, and they're wreaking havoc. They damage infrastructure. They will suck all the nutrients out of a lake. So while Lake Erie has a problem with too many nutrients, too much phosphorus, there's places in Georgian Bay where the impacts from invasive species have left them nutrient poor and not enough for that ecosystem. So it's really interesting, that dynamic. But it's something that takes a lot of energy and commitment to get a handle on, both once they've established, but also in the prevention. A huge part of invasive species work is preventing the next one from entering the Great Lakes system. So I'll say that as well. But there are types that are really causing a lot of issues, not only the mussels, but Phragmites. If you live near the Great Lakes, you might have heard of that invasive, can just grow so tall and overtake the shoreline in a really serious way, competing with native species. And it's a big issue to the economy as well. And it comes back to, if we want the Great Lakes to be this crown jewel that we know it to be, we really rely on that natural system. And so nobody's going to go to Long Point Provincial Park if it's overrun with frag. So the investments in controlling invasive species and preventing them from taking hold pay dividends in the opportunities that we get to still enjoy that area for. So there's kind of two pieces. It's like controlling the ones that are here and preventing the next one from coming.
Great. Thanks. I have a question from Richard. This is coming back to the climate change conversation we were having earlier. What types of initiatives or programs can be employed to mitigate flooding from climate change events on vulnerable shorelines? Is this a question of better urban planning, building hard infrastructure like levees, etc.? Anastasia, why don't you start, and then Kelsey, you can add in.
Sure. So one of the things that we need to do collectively to build resilience against flooding is to invest in the natural infrastructure that Kelsey was talking about, because ultimately, as we do our planning and creating hard surfaces, that contributes to moving the water faster to the big channels, so that when there's a, climate change is meaning these bigger, more intense storms earlier in the season, so the ground might still be frozen, like all this stuff is happening, plus we're hardening our surfaces, that's a recipe for a lot more flooding. So one of the things we can do is invest in the resilience of trying to have our communities act more like a natural ecosystem to the extent that we can. And the challenge is, I was just thinking about the cottage that my parents own, and when my parents first bought it, my dad wanted to have a naturalized shoreline and wanted to just let it all erode. There was a barrier, a hard barrier, and he wanted to just let it all erode and go away. And his neighbors downstream were thinking, oh, okay, I don't want my property to flood. And so there's this tension between how we want to create resilience by having a natural water course, but that is going to impact individual property owners. And this is a big challenge. And I hope it's a solution, if we're solutions oriented and we start thinking about, can we invest in resilience on a community basis, on a provincial basis, so that ultimately everybody is better off, and we don't need to harden our shorelines more to protect us from flooding, but we find some other solutions. But in the sort of at the individual level, it can be really, really devastating and challenging and frustrating. And so it's sort of one of these wicked problems we're trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, today, like, I just looking at the weather forecast, and the remnants of tropical storm Bertha. It's only May, and we have like remnants of a tropical storm are like rolling into southern Ontario, where we might get up to 40 millimeters of rain. Obviously, if a lot more of the watersheds in southern Ontario were covered in forests, all that water wouldn't immediately run into the Great Lakes. But as we get more and more of these very heavy rainfall events, which it happens as the planet warms, we can expect more and more of this. And the only way is through some kind of collective action, because hardening the shoreline by your cottage or by someone's house on the lake is not going to stop the water from coming into the lake from all that farmland. So we need to think about these problems differently, I think. Let's have another question here, and then we're going to have to move on, I think. Oh, here's one, another algae question. The Thames River has been identified, Thames in London, Ontario, not London, England, has been identified as the top Canadian river for contributing phosphorus to Lake Erie. What projects are in place to save this river and thus the lake? Kelsey, any thoughts on that one?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, the Thames River is a huge piece of the puzzle on our Canadian side. The western basin of Lake Erie kind of has Ohio and Ontario and some other states. So in the Ontario side of things, it's a really important waterway. And it's actually quite incredible. I'll just mention, like, this winter in January, there was a rainstorm event that contributed like a year's worth of phosphorus in like 3 days, because it was, in the middle of winter, and so much nutrient was able to get into the river with such a heavy storm. So it's a super important waterway. There are some projects underway. There is an initiative called the Thames River Phosphorus Reduction Collaborative, and they are looking at a variety of ways. They have a variety of projects to try to trap the phosphorus before it gets into the river and into the lake. And they're experimenting with a few different methods, working a lot with the agricultural community. That's a partnership with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. So a good example of partnership there. And so I'm really hopeful to see, what those results are from that project, but it's a huge piece of the puzzle. And actually, you know, when we want to do this like finger pointing, like it's the state's problem and we shouldn't have to worry about it here in Canada, the Thames River proves us wrong every time, because we can see the really high phosphorus levels in the Thames. And actually the Thames River has had blooms of its own, has had these algae blooms in the river itself. So we know that that watershed is under stress and getting way more phosphorus. But yeah, luckily, yes, there are projects underway.
Great. And one last one from our audience, one from Debbie, talking about the cost of algae in Lake Erie, which was, you mentioned that, Kelsey, various costs. But why does algae in particular impact the commercial and tourism industry? Like, why is that? What's the link between algae and tourism?
Sure, yeah, so a few different things. And I think the first kind of like low-hanging fruit is just that people don't want to visit when there's a stinky algae bloom nearby. So people, you know, it kind of turns off cottagers and people who are recreational fishing and using the beaches. And beach closures, actually, the beach could just end up being, you know, it's a public health situation at that point if there's toxic algae threatening that shoreline, so which has happened in the past. But in terms of the fisheries, what can happen is the algae creates these dead zones in the lake where the food chain really can't survive. So fish are going to be dying off from that type of an impact. And so for Lake Erie, that's huge because it's such an important commercial fishery for pickerel and perch, really delicious. But that's a very real threat that they've had to contend with in years past. And so there's, yeah, a variety of impacts. It basically just makes, you know, the natural system that allows all these economies to thrive, if that breaks down, the economies do too.
Anastasia, anything to add on that?
I was just thinking that it's also so much more complicated now, because the road salt issue that someone asked about, the saltier the water, the more that the algal blooms can, we can create a bigger problem for algal blooms. And it's my understanding it's because the salty water doesn't allow the mixing. So I kind of picture it as like this stuff's kind of skirting across the water and creating a different interaction than it would if we were looking at those blooms, which we were back in the 70s and 80s. So it's complicated and it requires this sort of systems thinking. Think like an ecosystem, work on all of these things, not just one issue at a time, not just end of pipe anymore.
Mm-hmm. And climate change is another like X factor that's throwing the whole system for a loop. The warmer the waters, the worse the algae gets, and more precipitation, more, you know, runoff into the lake. So it's a variety of factors and a really complicated system. So yeah, there's a lot going on.
I think we're running out of time now, so I just want to go to like one last kind of wrap up question / comment from both of you. But I was just thinking about this, is that when Europeans arrived in the Great Lakes Basin, you know, one of the statistics that I read about in a book years ago that was written by parents of an old friend of mine, was that there were more people, Aboriginal people, living on the north shore of Lake Erie than live there now. And they were living in very large towns and villages, agriculture, fishing, etc. But it just underscores the productivity of the Great Lakes ecosystem. It was able to support so many humans and to do so for very long periods of time, very sustainably. And you know, I grew up on the shore of Lake Huron and loved it and loved the abundances of the lake. And I really wonder if, you know, can we ever get to a place when we're talking about the Great Lakes that we're not talking about mitigating damage and endangered species and invasive species and algae? And, you know, could we ever get to a point where we're talking about how to deal with the abundance that the lake provides in terms of fish and water and food? And, you know, could we ever get back to the time, you know, before we kind of made a mess of the Great Lakes? And Anastasia, why don't you go first, and then Kelsey?
I think so. And I think so because, as you sort of pointed out, there is so much we can learn if we embrace ways of knowing that are different than just what we brought us settlers with our science, integrating kind of the same themes I already mentioned, right? Integrating, embracing, decolonizing, learning, and changing how we interact, and having our governance systems evolve and change as well. I know we can get there, and we just need the will and the investment and the tenacity and the perseverance to keep doing it. And I'm in for keep doing it.
Excellent. Kelsey.
Me too. I'm also in. When I picture a future for the Great Lakes, that's how I like to picture it, is that abundant, resilient communities that are connected to nature. And it is such an iconic region. There's a reason that 20 of Canada's largest cities are in the Great Lakes region. 37 people live in that map that I showed you. That's huge. And there's good reason for it. And so I think with investment, we can get there. And I'm really inspired by seeing what's happened in the States, where they've dedicated funds, $300 million in a federal budget. Doesn't seem like, a crazy amount of money. I mean, it's a lot of money, but, just with that investment, we've been able to turn out amazing results. And if you look at a city like Ashtabula, really small town, dealing with that toxic legacy, and then now it's thriving. So when I think of the Great Lakes future, I picture it thriving.
Great. Thanks to you both. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So thanks for both of you, of course. And thanks for everyone for joining us today and all of the thoughtful questions that you sent along. As we learned today, restoring the Great Lakes would not only benefit our environment, but would also help to re-stimulate the economy after we recover from this COVID-19 pandemic. Right now, Canada can choose a better path for its future and its economy, one that's green and puts people before polluters. You can get involved and you can take action by signing our petition, which sends a letter to your Member of Parliament at environmentaldefense.ca/green recovery. We'll be sending you a follow-up email with a link to this petition, and as well, that'll also tell you where you can watch this entire webinar on YouTube. I really want to take a moment just to say thank you to all the environmental defense supporters who are tuning in today, and for all of the events that have been in this recovery series. It's encouraging to see so many of you taking action to protect the environment, even during troubling and sometimes difficult times for all of us. And while this may be our last episode of the recovery series, we're going to be hosting more online events during the summer. Speaking of which, next week, be sure to join us for an exciting event. We'll be sharing special access for you to watch the documentary, The Story of Plastics, created by the same people who did The Story of Stuff. You may have seen that. And next Thursday, we'll be hosting a follow-up discussion about the film with our experts, where you can ask them all of your burning questions about plastics and their impacts on the environment and human health. Be sure to sign up to get a link to the film and to join us for the discussion. Again, special thanks to our speakers today, Anastasia Lintner and Kelsey Scarfone, for their expertise and insights. And please keep in touch with Environmental Defense. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or you can reach out to us by email. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.